My name is Georgie Weems, and I'm somebody who's been involved in Bengal History Week for some time. And just about 30 seconds ago, Dr. Ahmedullah just came up to me and said, "Can you introduce me, please?" And I just heard you laughing. I think that just about sums up this amazing and incredibly modest organizer. So this is the 10th anniversary of Bengal History Week, which was an initiative of some individuals within Brick Lane Circle. It's been going successfully for 10 years, and really the reach of the group and of this has extended over that period, and we've had lots and lots of really fascinating lectures, seminars, plays, etc., over that period. And I think it's great that the penultimate event of this year's Bengal History Week is the session that we're going to have now, presented by Dr. M Ahmedullah, after the Banda Massacre, the Tears of Myristica Fragrans, and I'm not pronouncing that properly, it's Latin, which I think is a demonstration of the increasing interest that you've had in this particular part of history, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about it. So you're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have some discussion after that. Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgie. Thank you for coming to this presentation tonight. I just say something first before I start, This is a very historical topic, and obviously it's going back more than 400 years. But I'm not a historian, by the way. I got interested in history. I never studied history in a school or properly. We had history classes in secondary school, but never took an interest and never studied at university level. But as I grew up, I realized that history is really important, and history is also very powerful. Those who know history, they have more power than those who don't know, right? And if you don't know history, it creates so much disadvantage for you. If you engage at the cutting edge level of history, historical interpretation, research, and so on, then you learn so much. You learn lessons. You learn about human nature. You learn about conflicts. You learn about strategies. You learn about how one person overcame another person, conflict and competition, and you learn so much. But if you don't know history, then you are quite blind. People who know history, they could be good people or bad people. If they're bad, then they will manipulate you and use you. If they're good, then they will help you. So that's one of the reasons why Brick Lane Circle, we started to do some work on history. We have done on also other areas of work as well. And so we've been doing this. And what we have found that once we go into one field, and other new fields opens up, right? So this, nobody previously would have thought that this has any links with Bengal, right? The nutmeg, the story of nutmeg, and the spice wars, between the English and the Dutch, and what happened to those islands. About, maybe 5-6 years ago, I came across an article on the internet when I was researching on the early Portuguese in Bengal. When the Portuguese came and what they did and so on. Then I came across lots of other materials, which, started to generate interest in me. So I read an article by, I've got the lady's name here. She's like a mixed race. Her father was Dutch, and her mother was Dutch-Japanese mix. Lived in Burma, before colonialism ended. So she wrote an article on Bengali slavery, by the Dutch. In that article, she talked about, from 1624 until 1665, right? Nearly every year, Dutch bought Bengali slaves from Arakan. Arakan is where Rohingya country is, where they've been expelled. So the Arakanis were capturing Bengalis from all the way to Calcutta, Pipli, all the way, like Noakhali and Chittagong, all those coastal areas. They've been capturing Bengali and taking them into slaves. And sometimes, there are a lot of wars as well between Arakan and people who were ruling Bengal. Sometimes Mughals, and there were pre-Mughals as well. And during the war, when Arakanese army came quite deep inside Bengal, they would take all sorts of, just capture, villages and take them back. And there was the slave market. But also is what happened, Arakan army, different levels, right, would get allocated different number of slaves. So they could either put them to work or sell them, right? And there was one rule in Arakan that if, when you capture a slave, they were mostly Bengalis, if any slave has already stayed in Arakan for 1 year or more, then you cannot sell them. Probably because they have already been used and they're doing good work. But if somebody hasn't lived there for 1 year, then you can sell them. So Marau slave market in Arakan, present-day Burma, was a big slave market. Just one more thing before I start. When I was studying about the Portuguese in Bengal, I came across a piece of information about a particular Portuguese official, who was in Goa. He got sort of prosecuted, for embezzlement fraud, and then they made a stock of his property, and he owned 18 slaves, 6 Chinese slaves, 6 Bengali slaves. This was like late 1500, before the Dutch or the English ever got there. So slavery was active, quite sort of prominent. The slavery in that part of the world ended when this slavery was abolished, and the Dutch kind of implemented in the 1860s, I think. That's when slavery was, finally sort of eradicated from that part of the world. So what I will do, this study is still like work in progress, right? I haven't still been managed to make all the connections, right? So I'm going to share with you what I have learned so far, and I'm hoping to do, actually what I'm hoping to do is to write a book in 2021 to celebrate the 50 years of Bangladesh independence, on this topic, right? So maybe end of 2021. It'll be a self-published book, by the way, right? So I will start now. This is like an image created of the massacre, right? Now this is Fort Nassau. At the moment, it's a ruin. How do you say this? It's in ruins, right? Yeah, right. You still get quite a. I'll show you later on. I've got some images, right? And this is where the massacre took place, right? And this is the sea. Between those islands and this one, it's not very much distance. It looks like a river, but it's a sea, and it's quite deep water channel, and that's why you get very large ships coming here, right? So I'm going to come to this later on. This is Myristica Fragrans. It's a scientific name for nutmeg. Have you ever seen nutmeg in real life before, anyone? Oh, you have, right? You were there for 10 years, weren't you? Oh, 4, right, yeah, okay, right, yeah. Now, it just looks so beautiful, right? But this rots very quickly. So it's not like peach or something, they stay a long time, but this rots very quickly. This is what nutmeg trees look like. What happens? You are only allowed to pick when you start to open, right? And you can see the red bit, It's rude to pick before. This is the red bit, and mace is made from red bit. When it dries, it becomes mace. Mace was more expensive than nutmeg. because of you need so much, in terms of weight. This is the nutmeg shell. So when you break this, then you get the nutmeg, which you can grate. But when I was in Banda Islands recently, guy sold me some nutmeg coffee, and he was explaining the process. I'm not sure if I fully understood, but he was telling me that the shell of the nutmeg, they roast it, and the coffee comes from the shell of the nutmeg. I've got some nutmeg there. You can have a look later on. When you are in the Banda Islands, especially to Roon, you don't know anything about it, and Lontor, when you're walking around, you see this everywhere on the floor, people drying, This is like ordinary people drying. But there are like bigger establishments where they do it like professionally, they use smoke, right? Nearly everybody in those islands are involved in some kind of capacity in growing or harvesting, nutmeg. This is what nutmeg looks like when you break. This is the inside, and that's the shell. Now, nutmeg historically only grew in a very small part of the world, and it was called Banda Islands. If you look at the map, this is Jakarta here, and Malaysia is there, and Banda Islands is there. There is no direct flight to Banda Islands. You have to go to Ambon. You can take a ship. It takes 4 days, 4 nights, right? And it stops in various places. So I took a plane, went to Ambon, and then 22 hours by ship, to Banda. It was a comfortable ship, nice cabin. Only if you get cabin, right? Because the lady where I booked the hotel, she advised me not to take the ship from Jakarta. She said, if you take it 4 days, you'll have to share toilet with 2,000 people on board. So Banda Islands, there are about 11 or 10 or 11 pieces of land. Only 6 is inhabitable. That's Roon, this is the Banda Api, this is the mountain, the fire volcanic. This is Naira, this is the administrative center. And this is Lontor, the big one. And Pisang and Hatta, Rosengain is called. This island has no fresh water, right? That create problem for the English who are trying to keep it, and prevent Dutch from take over. Again, this is the administrative island, and deep sea. This is a very deep sea, so you get a big ship coming. Now, Spice Islands, right? Historically, right? Spice Islands were only these islands. This one, Ternate. You were trying to pronounce Ternate earlier on. Ternate and Tidore. These were the most famous Spice Islands. These two. These two tiny ones at the top, they were the most famous. And those two, they had sultans, sultans who controlled the different sultans and rivals. And between them, they used to control this area, and a lot of these places were under the control of these two islands separately. They were rivals, right? Yeah? Sometimes one would take over from the other parts, right? So these were the only Spice Island, and because these islands were like a remote place and small, and there was no other bigger power there, so the Dutch thought they could actually monopolize. Pepper they couldn't monopolize because pepper is grown in Sumatra, in Java, and they've got big powers and very big land and very long history of trading with outside world. These islands also had historically, strong trade going back thousands of years, but they were like very, small powers, and quite far. You see, Banda is so small, and this was the most expensive place at that time when the English and the Dutch were trying to fight over this because of nutmeg. Because nutmeg used to be the most expensive spice in Europe. I don't know what the prices were like in India or in other places, but in Europe it was expensive, and because they could make so much money in Europe from nutmeg, that's why they came, so far to get nutmeg. And cloves were only grown in this part. Cloves, see, this is the clove island. Nutmeg didn't used to grow there. Nutmeg was only here. Cloves was a bit more widespread, but original home of cloves were those two, and through the clove, that's where they make their money. They didn't have anything else, So traders used to come, bring all their other needs, rice, sago, and Indian textiles, Balinese textiles, and Chinese porcelain, and other items. Traders used to bring in return for nutmeg. The other thing is this, although they had sultans there, these islands, the Banda Islands, had no sultans, right? There's no overall ruler, right? Each village, there's lots of villages, more than this, right? They had their own village chiefs called Orankaya, literally means rich people. In Bengali we say Borolok, but they probably have a bit more different meanings, to Orankaya. But there was no overall and a ruler. There were rivalry between different Orankayas or different islands sometimes. But these people were what I gathered from reading is that these people were really fierce warrior, fighters, and they wanted to protect their freedom, and they've been doing this for a long time. The Portuguese tried to set up a fort in early 1500s, and they were beaten, and the Portuguese foundation was still there, when the Dutch arrived. So they were really independent, and they tried their best, to protect their independence, but the Dutch massacred them. If you go to if you go to Banda now, I'm just going to show you some of the scenes, what you might see. This is a museum, in Banda Naira, the administrative island. And you can see the massacre picture there, and this is the person who was responsible for the massacre. His name is Jan, what's his name? Jan Peterson Cohen. Peterson, something like that, anyway. That's him. Yeah, Jan Peterson Cohen. This is the monument, for the massacre, and they've named all the people that were sort of massacred in there. I believe this monument was built quite recently, maybe 20, 30 years ago. This is the fort that is still standing intact. This is the biggest and the strongest. This was repaired by the Dutch several times and enlarged. And when I went there, I couldn't go higher, so I couldn't take picture of the whole thing, right? That's the highest I could go. But when you go there and you walk around, and you can see how strategically they've done this, because you can see everything, right? Who's coming and who's going, and you could use your cannons. See, this is where cannon is to mount their cannons, right? Yeah? You could fire. I don't know what the range was of the cannons, but you can see how this was so strategic, and how they could control, who was coming and who was going. Now that's the same fort, but this is from Fort Nassau. Fort Nassau was the first fort, the Dutch built. Nassau is in ruins. This is Nassau. Now, this is Pulau Ran. This is the island where the English stood out, for 4 years, and the Dutch put a siege and tried to starve them to submission. This is the only place, where you can kind of land, but large ship cannot come because it's not deep enough. And the other side, all over, no ship can really easily come, because the water is so savage. Those days it would crush you, and a lot of ships got destroyed on the other side. The rocks, and the water is really violent. So only this side is you can kind of land. So when the siege was on, the English put all their defense on this side. They know that there's no way the Dutch could land on the other side. That's cloves. People are drying cloves. You can see nutmeg and cloves. And also those islands, they got some really pretty small houses. They're very small, but houses are really pretty. This is a Moharram procession, I think American style. Drying cloves and nutmeg. Now, just one more thing. These are canary trees, right? I've got some canary nuts there as well. Canary trees are planted in nutmeg gardens. They are about 2 or 3 times taller and bigger. They provide shade. Nutmeg needs some kind of shade, to grow. The canary nuts, they're not owned by anybody, those trees. And you cannot go up the tree to collect the nuts. It's for everybody, whoever can. So they just wait for the nuts to drop. That's when they go and collect. So they don't allow people to climb, because then young men would have more, their body is stronger, and they can go, and the old men and old women, they won't be able to go and compete with. So there's like a ban of, but there has been violations, and people have talked about it. This is the Dutch church. This mountain, this is the other side of the sea. This church is on this side, of the administrative island. Now, this church was burnt, in 1991. There was communal riots between Muslims and Christians in Ambon. It was quite savage, there were gunfights, for I don't remember how long. But then the Indonesian army had to evacuate the Muslims, from Ambon, some of them. And then the nearest place by ship brought them here. And then some people turned on some very small Christian community. Right? It was very odd. And there's a nice mosque. This is the other side, that Combo Island, we'll be talking about later on. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite this young lady. She's going to read you a nice, beautiful story.
Once upon a time, there was a couple who had fallen in love. The woman's name was Ganafus, and the man's name was Gamalama. They had been entwined in love for so long that even their parents knew about their relationship. One day, the lovers decided to take a holiday together, and they agreed that they would travel through the Isles of Maluku. After determining the best time and getting the blessings of their parents, they departed in a sailboat. Before leaving, Ganafus's mother entrusted a golden comb to her daughter and gave her a warning. "Child, do not lose this comb. You have 7 days and 7 nights away together before the full moon ends. Before the rooster crows for the 3rd time on the 7th day, you must have returned home. If not, something bad will happen to you." Such a message should not fail to make an impression on the memory. The sails of the boat had been extended, the wind blew the ship away from the island, and the lovers enjoyed every moment they spent together. After 2 days, they arrived at Banda Massacre Island. White sands, colourful corals, and a multitude of various fish welcomed them. They were fascinated by such beauty as they had never seen before. The couple agreed to spend 3 days together in Banda Massacre. Just 3 days of enjoyment and pleasure, swimming, catching fish, and eating it on the white sandy beaches. Without realising it, It was as if they had fallen asleep, as if in the midst of the beauty of Banda Massacre they had forgotten their promise to Ganapus's mother. On the night of the seventh day, suddenly, the words of warning came back to them. Ganapus and Gamalama began to panic, and hurriedly got ready to leave the island. The boat's sails were raised, and they were ready to depart. But then Ganapus said, "Kanda, wait for me for a moment. I must look for the golden comb that my mother gave me." She looked here and there and everywhere, on the white sand, between the trees, but it had disappeared. Finally, by chance, she glanced at a rock and the comb appeared there on the top of it. She quickly took it with her on the boat and they set sail. Not long into their journey, the first rooster crowed. Ganapus panicked, and while combing her hair, she said, "Kanda, go ahead and leave me." But Gamalama replied, "Do not leave me alone to wander by myself through the ocean." Then the second rooster crowed, and Ganapus plunged into the Banda Sea. And she prayed her lover, Gamalama, would be given the power to sail back home as fast as light. Her prayer was granted, and as fast as light, Gamalama reached the north of Maluku. But fortune was not on their side, and when the crow of the third rooster was heard, both of their bodies transformed into mountains. Ganapus became a volcano in the Banda Islands, and Gamalama became a volcano in Ternate, North Maluku. And the golden comb of Ganapus's mother turned into Banda Massacre Island. To this day, if Mount Gamalama erupts in Ternate, the tremors will be felt in Banda Massacre too, as Ganapus responds to her lover.
The purpose of this story was to show one of the Gamalama mountain. It was the guy, wasn't he? The guy became Gamalama, and the girl became Ganapus, the fire mountain. And the comb became this one, right? And this is the fire mountain. This was the Naira, where they holidayed, right? But the other mountain was there. So what this illustrates, that this is like a folk story, right? What this illustrates is that all those places are connected historically. People have links and relationship. It's in their mind, it's in their like emotion. And I was surprised, I see young boys in small kora, like canoe, and they're so expert. These people are just like sea is like their natural home. Okay, I'm going to go through all this very quickly. Spice war, Spice war started between the Dutch and the English. When you see, for about 100 years, Portuguese they were bringing spice, from Asia, and textiles from India, and so on. And they kind of had the monopoly. But England had good relationship with Portugal. But there was an Iberian Union, Portugal became part of Spain. And around that time as well, the Netherlands, they were kind of rebelling because they were under Spanish control. So anyway, after Netherlands kind of rebelled and Portugal joined Spain, the Spanish crown forbade Portugal from supplying any spice to England. But by the 1590s, the English ships were actually trying to get to Asia. In 1594, two ships got there in near present-day Malaysia, Penang, but didn't return home intact. They all got destroyed en route. So it wasn't successful. But it was successful in another way because they gained good knowledge and information. And it was led by James Lancaster. So when East India Company started English, he was also chosen as the captain to lead the first voyage of the East India Company. But how it all started with the English and the Dutch, is the Dutch sent 2 voyages, 1595 and 1598, and they came back with lots and lots of spice, especially the second one, and they made so much profit. And the English were then worried that Dutch were going to now monopolize, the spice, and they were going to lose out, and all the income, Dutch will become very rich. They will have to rely on the Dutch. So then they quickly got together and formed East India Company, and Queen Elizabeth I gave them charter. So the first East India Company voyage, started February 1601, and came back, I think, September 1603. Now, this Dutch voyages, they were not by Dutch East India Company. There was one company was called Company for Far Places. But what happened? Dutch, various cities in the Netherlands, they're merchant. They were putting money together and sending expeditions to various places. So the Dutch were going to India, all over the place in Asia. But then in 1602, the Dutch government got all those companies together and kind of forced them to become VOC, the Dutch East India Company. And the first Dutch East India Company voyage started a journey in 1604. And it was from then they started to actually try to take over territories and flush the Portuguese out of the Spice Islands. You can see the scale. I mean, these are English ships and Dutch ships, right? And these are only to Banda, because I give you an example. The first expedition, 2 ships, Dutch ship, got to Banda, but the expedition. This was the second expedition of the Dutch, right? But the first to Banda, and this particular expedition, they started with 8 ships from the Netherlands, and then got to Banten, which is West Java in Indonesia, and they filled 4 ships with spices, and then they returned. And the other 2 ships, 2 went to Ternate, right, Ambon, then Ternate, and then 2 went to Banda, right? So, and the same with the Dutch, right? Sorry. So with the English one, this is the second voyage of East India Company. They started with 4 ships. So 2 went to Banten. Again, they, filled their ships with. So 4 went to Banten. 2 filled their ships with spices and came back. And the other 2 went to Ambon, and then 1 went to Ternate, and the other one went to Banda. So these are the number of ships that came to Banda, not the number of ships that left Netherlands or England. By say 1621, you can see Netherlands had sent more than 81 ships to Banda alone, and English only managed 13. But the number to Asia is a lot more. I don't have the figure with me at the moment, right? I didn't fully understand how was it possible for a smaller country like Netherlands to send so many ships and so many people into Asia, right? I've read some like views and analysis where they talk about the Dutch developed a particular financial kind of model which enabled them to become acquire more resources. It's also the system in England, the political system, and the East India Company and their financiers and so on. So East India Company was sending a fraction in terms of the number of the ships that the Dutch were sending. But one of the difference between the Dutch and the English East India Company is that the English East India Company, at the beginning, they were not showing any sort of desires or any kind of expression to take over lands, and forcibly get people to trade with them, right? English, in some of the treaties, some of the discussion that I've read when they went to meet a ruler, in any part, they always talked about free trade, and God gave the world, to men, and in different countries, different regions, grow different things and have different natural resources, and no country can live on their own natural resources. So God wanted people to exchange, so there must be free trade. So this is the mantra, even the English East India Company officers were taking with them, right? And well, they didn't practice it, right? But this is what they were taking with them, when they wanted to engage with the trade. This is just an example of first world voyage of East India Company. You can see all the different places that they've been to. And similarly, the Dutch voyages as well, they went to Africa, Arabia, India, Macau, Japan, present-day Thailand, Patani, and many other places. The conflict between the Dutch and the Bandani started properly, when the Dutch landed, I think about 13 or 14 ships with about 1,000 soldiers and people on board in 1609, to build Fort Nassau. But local people didn't want, because they wanted to maintain their independence. Prior to that, a couple of years before that, the Dutch managed to force some Orang Kayas or some leaders of villages to sign an agreement with the Dutch. The Dutch will provide them protection from the Portuguese, like the Saudis get protection from the Americans. So in return for Nutmeg monopoly. But because they didn't have a particular single sultan, so nobody could really sign a contract on behalf of everybody else. So this created a problem. So when Verhoeven, landed in 1609 in Naira, island Naira, a lot of the people, because his large amount of soldiers, they fled Naira, and some went to Lontor, the Combe Island, and so on. But the local people were objecting, trying to kind of resist, but they couldn't kind of stop. They came in big force. And then this is how the story is told by the Dutch, right? But I don't believe for a minute that this is how things actually happen. So the story goes like this. When they were building the Fort Nassau, they were invited by some of the Orang Kayas who fled, to come and negotiate, discuss with them. So the commander, he took, I don't know, maybe 100 or 50, I forgot the number, soldiers and his deputies with him to meet at a designated place. But when he got there were nobody there, and then they sent search parties to find where these people are, who wanted to negotiate with us. But then the search party found some of the local Orang Kayas, and the Orang Kayas told them, look, we're afraid because the commander came with soldiers, right, with guns and weapons. So if you could ask the commander to keep his soldiers far, only him and some of his deputies come and talk to us. About maybe 30 or so came. And then when they were near the designated place where the Orang Kayas asked them to come, they were ambushed and killed. All of them were killed. So the commander, with about 20 or 30 Dutch men, not soldiers, because soldiers were behind, the other officials and the entourage, they got killed. Then what happened is the Dutch people, the soldiers came looking for them because they heard, but apparently the soldiers didn't find anybody, only found dead bodies, right? And this island is so small, from one side to the other, it takes half an hour. So I find the whole story is a little bit kind of unbelievable as it is told. But then the new commander, they had an election. They came together and selected and elected a new commander of the Dutch, and then they hurriedly, tried to finish the fort, and then they kind of took their revenge, went to they go to the villages and burn villages and kill people for revenge. But then at the end, the Orang Kayas, they agreed to come and agree a peace treaty, peace agreement with the Dutch. And in that peace agreement, this would be the second peace agreement, or no, third, right? Because every time there's an updated conditions. And this time they were told that they're not allowed to, there won't be any more inter-island trade, right? They have to get Dutch passes, right, to carry out inter-island trade. And they cannot sell nutmeg to anybody else, right? So every time there was a new treaty, there was another condition attached. Several years later, because the island of Ai, which was far, I showed you in the map, the island of Ai and island of Roon, they were like about 8 to 10 miles from the administrative center island, right? Those people were not part of any agreement with the Dutch, previously. But the Dutch tried to claim that when the people who signed contract with them, that meant all the islands. But there was no overall ruler, so it was kind of not something logical. The other thing I want to point out is that what the Dutch were doing, they were trying to keep meticulous records, of contract and treaties. Right? They forced the local people to sign for two reasons. One is that in Europe prior, they will be challenged, right, by others, the English and the Spanish. So Dutch were trying to create facts on the ground and create records which will justify their position based on European tradition of claiming lands and taking over other people's lands. And so they were using like a lot of sophisticated theories that were prevalent in Europe those days to make claims. But the local people, they sort of never understood, or and also like when you even now you're getting contract between the Brexit contract is taking so long, and they got these people to agree contract by one sitting. Basically, it's through dictates, So the Dutch commander, from Naira, they tried to capture Ai Island and landed in Ai 1615 first, right? And then the story that has been told is that they after fierce fighting with the local, and there were some English people there, they were training the local Bandanese and giving them guns, and weapons to fight the Dutch. And the Dutch kind of landed, and they landed, and then it was a night, so they took over most of the island, but they decided to have rest. But while they were resting, the Bandanese regrouped and came, and then there were a lot of Dutch people were killed, and then they had to retreat and go back. Then the Dutch came back a few months later with a bigger force for revenge. But while they were coming for revenge, 5 English ships appeared. This time English for the first time come in bigger, stronger numbers. And so the English 5 ships, the captain, he put the 5 ships between Naira and Ai Island, right? And then the battle started, sea battle between the Dutch and the English. But something really strange happened. I don't know if it's believable again. Then suddenly the English captain decided not to fight anymore, the commander, because he just heard the name of the commander of the Dutch, right? And his name is something Lamb. I'll come to that. I don't know how to pronounce the name, right? Apparently, the Dutch commander saved the English commander's life when the Portuguese were nearly killing him near St. Helena Islands. So he couldn't fight the commander, who saved his life, right? Then he agreed with the Dutch commander that he's going to go. The English people must be safe, and also gave the Dutch some intelligence about the island, and he left. Then the Dutch went and killed. They took over the whole island, right? And they smashed up, this like an English little factory, and the Dutch established a fort, and they named it Revenge because this is like a revenge. So Fort Revenge. Yeah, I think I'm taking too long, right? What I will say is that the Dutch were, in a strong position. They were coming in bigger numbers and getting more and more land under their kind of control, but not all. And the people kept on giving them, resistance in different ways. So Dutch didn't have full control, right? So after they took over Island is not far from Roon, and many Islanders also escaped, and went to Roon Island. Okay, what I will say, and then a lot of things happened. I'm not going to go into that. In 1616, October, the English commander of the whole Asian English East India Company enterprise, he sent 2 ships, to go and occupy the remaining island, right, to make English claim. Because if they lose Roon, then they would have no access to nutmeg, right? And Roon was full of nutmeg trees. But Roon doesn't have water, natural kind of water, natural water, fresh water, right? Water comes from other places. So the English commander, Nathaniel Courthope, he took 2 ships and went, and on 23rd of December 1616, he got to the island, where I was showing you, and said, ships can only come and stop there. He got there, and the Orang Kayas from the island came on board, and he asked them, have you signed any treaty with the Dutch? He said no, right? Then he quickly got the Orang Kayas of Roon to sign a treaty. I've got the treaty here, right here, to sign a treaty. But also some Orang Kayas from Island was there as well, so they also were signatory. So technically, they gave those islands to King James, and it became King James's possession. Right. And then so Courthope, the English commander, he established a base there from 16 December, and but the Dutch came, confronted him from day one, after landing on 25th on Christmas Day. But then the commander took their big guns out of the ship and placed them in strategic position, and the Dutch didn't kind of dare, fight them through. But what the Dutch decided to put a blockade, right, prevent other ships from coming, and local people from supplying. They thought they would starve them to death, and the English from Bantan, where the base was.
Sorry, this gentleman, are you discussing about after the Banda Massacre?
Yes.
Oh. Is it right place? Okay, thank you. Sorry.
It's okay.
I think that the place they seem to change. Okay, sorry.
Okay. Right. So the English captain had 2 ships, right, and then the guns protecting the island, but not enough food because they didn't bring enough food, right? But at night, some of the other islanders, they did come and supply throughout the 4-year siege, right? But what happened soon after the English arrival and taking over of the small island, they lost both of their ships. They were captured by the Dutch and taken. So now they're completely marooned, right? And one of the ships lost. They were trying to get fresh water from another island, right? And en route, they were ambushed by the Dutch and the ship taken. So then they were kind of marooned. But then they still did manage to smuggle letters, to Bantan, where the English headquarters was, asking for relief, asking for help. And occasionally, English did try to send help, but they didn't manage to get to the island. One of the famous incidents is when ship Solomon and another one captured by the Dutch just before they reached Roon. And those ships had a lot of supplies, but Dutch managed to take them, and then Dutch took the prisoners to Island. And there's some description from the English how Dutch is to urinate over their head and tie them up and humiliate them. It's quite, but this is from the English source, Dutch source might say something different. These are some of the treaties. I won't go into details. Another thing I want to point out is that a lot of the treaties, they also talk about not harassing Bandanese women, not being disrespectful, and not treating women badly. So it's possible that the Dutch, they were harassing the women there. There's two stories I found. Is from the first voyage of East India Company. Dutch ship, they were near Bali, and they saw Balinese women. So some Dutch sailors are on board. They decided to abandon the ship and just make their life in Bali. And later on, Captain David Middleton, he reported this. He said, at the island of Bangaya, near Ambon, there's a Hollander there who told me that the king had fled for fear of the king of Makassar, who had 2 houses. This Hollander had 2 houses of the young women of the island for his own use, taking as many women as he pleased, and had many slaves, both men and women. So, so the Bandanese, even all those agreements were imposed, but they were still stipulating that they must say that they will not harass their women, or treat them badly. This is the picture of Revenge Island, ruins of the Fort Revenge. This is Benteng, Hollandia. This is from the Combe Island. They built that after the massacre, when they carried out the massacre that we will talk about in a minute. This is Hollandia Island, fort. So you can see the forts all of them are strategically placed, and together they can cover the whole area around. Yeah, this is siege, around island. I just go through. Captain Nathaniel, he comes in 1616. He gets an agreement with the islanders. Soon after, defense established in Roon and Nailaka. Nailaka is the tiny island. And then, while they were trying to get water from another place, they heard that some other islands, they were not happy with the Dutch, and they wanted to meet the English and come to an agreement with the English. So the English captain sent someone to go and get signed contracts from Lontor and Rosangain. I've got copies of those contracts as well. Those ships were taken by the Dutch, Swan, Defence, and Solomon. And then the Dutch tried to land actually on Roon, but the Bandanese crushed them at first. And this is a very strange one. I'm just going to tell you about this one. English were trying to actually see how they can come back, to the island. So in 1619, or 1618, a big armada, or English fleet arrived in that part of the world, commanded by someone called Sir Thomas Dale. He was in the Americas, in the Virginia Company, and he was quite efficient and ruthless. And he is the one who brought Pocahontas, back to this country, right? So they sent him to sort out the Dutch. And the English did have a lot of confidence. They thought they would really sort out the Dutch, right? En route, they lost their flagship near an island called Enganau, near Sumatra. And I'm not going to go into some of the brutality he carried out there. But then they came to Banten, and from there, they grouped with other ships, and then they decided they will go and attack Jakarta, take Jakarta from the... Jakarta was called Batavia. They were just establishing, and after that they will go to the Banda and the Moluccas. But en route, the Dutch took one English ship. The English took one Dutch ship, and in revenge, the Dutch destroyed the little factory the English had in Jakarta. And anyway, so they came to a large English fleet came near Jakarta, Batavia, in 1618. They came, 1619, and they met with a very relatively poor Dutch fleet, and Dutch commander who just got became the Governor General, of Asia, Dutch Asia, Jan Peterson Cohen. They decided to fight. So they spent, I don't remember how many hours fighting, between the Dutch and the English, but the English were more powerful. So the Dutch commander decided to retreat and go to Ambon and regroup from Ambon. Now then, the English commander, a lot of the commentators say he should have went for the kill. If he went and he destroyed the Dutch fleet, then he could have come back, taken over Jakarta, then he could have went and taken over Banda and Moluccas, the islands there. But what happened, apparently the English commander then hesitated. One of the reasons is, this is how things are explained, that those days, the English voyages, a lot of the voyages were single voyages. They were not, so each expedition had its own commander with a couple of ships, and they were financed by a single, a group of people for a single voyage. So some commanders, didn't want to waste more money or energy, and they probably just wanted to go back with their thing and make money and so on. So there wasn't like unified command, all right, and Dale couldn't force through a decision, and then what Dale did, he was probably criticized and became demoralized, and he went to India, and then he died in India of some disease. Then the Dutch came back with a bigger force and took over Jakarta and destroyed the English buildings and also the local prince, so local ruler who actually gave the Dutch, permission to set up. And then Dutch named the place Batavia and then started to build their new capital, in that part of the world. After that, Jan Cohen, he went to Banda Island with a big force, and this time determined to really sort everything out. The English commander was dead by then, and the Roon was taken over by the Dutch. So I didn't go into detail because it's taking too long. And then Jane Peterson Cohen's forces came to Naira, February, 1621, and then from there he planned to take over. And the first step was to go to island of Lonthor, which is the big island where they had the most nutmeg trees and most orang kayas, most kind of leaders. And they landed, there was a big fight, and the Bandanis were actually also very quite effective, very good at defending themselves. But like Mirjafar, they were betrayed, by one of their own, and then some of their other ones who helped the Dutch through secret, ways, into the interiors and showed them the way, and obviously they won. And after the Dutch kind of established themselves in the big island Lonthor, the local orang kaya, they wanted to come to peace terms, with the Dutch, and they came on board the Dutch ship, and then they had to sign agreement, and it was even harsher, more stronger conditions, stronger conditions. And then what happened? But some of the local Bandani, they were still fighting. They're ambushing Dutch soldiers, and killing some Dutch soldiers. And the Dutch took over, I forgot the name of the village, a place where they established their base in the big island in Lonthor. And in there, the commander, not the main commander, his deputy who was stationed to look after, be in charge of the forces in Lonthor, He took over a mosque and surrounding buildings for his soldiers, and so they were staying. And apparently one night, some light, they fell on the floor. It made a lot of noise, and that got everybody like agitated, and they were running around. The Dutch commander, he got up and he thought, some ambush or some insurrection about to start. This is how the story is told, right? And then what happened next couple of days, they brought everything under control. Nothing was happening anyway, but then they decided to torture the Orang Kayas, who were under their control, to confess that they were planning, some insurrection, right? And this new treaty meant that insurrection would mean treason and death sentence. So they were forced to confess, right, with a lot of torture, that they were part of a conspiracy. They was planning an insurrection, and then they were sentenced to death. And then the Japanese, because the Dutch were able to get a lot of Japanese mercenaries to be with them, bringing them to Banda Islands and other places. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to invite this young lady to read out an eyewitness account of the massacre.
The 44 prisoners, one had committed suicide, were brought within the castle. The 8 foremost Orang Kaya, those who it said had belled the cat, being kept apart, the others being herded together like sheep. A round enclosure was built of bamboo just outside the castle, and into it were brought the prisoners, well bound with cords and surrounded by guards. Their sentence was read out to them for having conspired against the life of the Heer General and having broken the terms of peace. Before the reading of the sentence, it was forbidden on pain of death for anyone else to enter the enclosure, except for only fathers and mothers. The condemned victims being brought within the enclosure, 6 Japanese soldiers were also ordered inside. And with their sharp swords, they beheaded and quartered the 8 chief Orang Kaya. And then they beheaded and quartered the 36 others. The execution was awful to see. The Orang Kaya died silently without uttering any sound except one of them, speaking in the Dutch tongue, said, "Sirs, have you then no mercy?" But indeed nothing availed. All that happened was so dreadful as to leave us stunned. The heads and quarters of who had been executed were impaled upon bamboo and so displayed. Thus it did happen. God knows who is right. All of us, as professing Christians, were filled with dismay at the way this affair was brought to a conclusion, and we took no pleasure in such dealings.
Thank you. Other Orang Kayas were also sentenced to death and beheaded, during the whole process. I'm going to do this very quickly. After the massacre, even before the massacre, because when they took over Ai a few years before, they already divided Ai into different plots, and gave to Dutch planters to look after and run. And the Dutch provided slaves for them to do all the work. And after the massacre, the main island was also divided into plots, because there hardly anybody left, to work. Some of the relatives, of the Orang Kayas that the Dutch killed, they were the older men were killed, and the younger ones were sent to Batavia, Jakarta, to work as slaves. So those islands had very few people left. It is estimated that out of over 15,000, about 1,000 were left, in all those islands. And a few years before, Dutch already brought some people from another island near Halmahera, near Philippines, after conquering that from the Spanish, brought them to Naira because they didn't want to leave them there, because if the Spanish come back, then they will be able to use their labor, and brought them to work in Naira, in the plantation. So they were already bringing, slaves into that part of the world. Dutch, the people who were given the plots, they became known as parkeneers. Most of the parkeneers I've been reading, they belong to, they worked for Dutch East India Company in some ways. When they retired their service, they took the opportunity to run, a nutmeg plantation. The parkeneers over the years, they had beautiful houses, and a lot of luxurious, marble and everything were brought from Holland, and they sort of ran. But they didn't become very rich, most of them, because Dutch used to buy all the nutmegs at a fixed price. So they didn't have the right, to sell nutmeg on the open market. So it was the VOC, the Dutch East India Company monopoly. I met, I'm going to show you his face in a minute. I met one descendant of a parkeneer. He doesn't look Dutch, he looks local. But he showed me his 12th grandfather's picture, who was a Dutchman. He's framed in the parken, where in one of the building where he lives and he does his stuff. And when the parkeneers started to come, and obviously, they needed workers, people to labor the nutmeg garden. So Dutch started to transport slaves, from many parts of, mainly present-day Indonesia, from many, different islands. But what surprised me is that they also bought slaves from Pulicat, in India, South India, and Bengali slaves from Arakan, for quite a long time. So this is what kind of, really surprised me. And that's why I've been searching. That's what got me interested in this story in the first place. Now, this is the guy. He's like 12th descendant, and that's his great, I don't know, 12th grandfather. He's a bit taller than the other Indonesian. This was one of the parken, the parkeneer's house. This is, this is like they produce nutmeg in industrial scale. It's on the second floor. So they put smoke, they burn things and let the smoke go. And this, he told me that this is the best way to produce nutmeg, the best quality nutmeg. This is the house of another parkeneer. This is in the Island, where the Fort Revenge is built. You can see it's like 100 meters long, the wall on one side. It's all in ruins now. There's goats. Can you see goats are eating in one of the buildings? Now, it's about Bengali slavery, right? This is the last bit. We got another reading soon, before we finish. This article by this lady was the one that got me interested in this. And then I read another book. It's a complete book by this gentleman. There's lots of information about Bengali slaves, the Arakan and the Dutch. One thing I want to point out is that in the first article, the article, the author implies that Bengali slaves were taken to Banda, but she doesn't directly state it, right? But implies, the timing and everything, and the labor that Banda needed, and the Dutch were coming regularly to buy. And by Dutch coming to buy Bengali slaves, that also stimulated demand for slaves, and more slave raiding took place. So the slave raiding level increased as a result of the Dutch demand for slaves. The second article, there's more stronger suggestion about Bengali slaves, being part of the group that were taken to Banda, right? But what I want to say is that I can only be sure once I look at the Dutch archives when the Bengali slaves arrived in Batavia, present-day Jakarta, exactly what happened to them. There would be some kind of records in some of the ship records. But I got into contact with a curator in a museum, in Holland, in Amsterdam, and she told me they think definitely Bengali slaves were taken to Banda. According to the article, Bengali slavery started, Dutch slavery started in 1624, just 3 years after the massacre, Banda Massacre. And the first shipment, 88 slaves in these two vessels, Jager and Mujis, to Batavia through Masalipatam, where they stopped. And the final shipment took place in 1665. That also makes sense because by then the Mughals were advancing, and 1667 the Mughals put a complete end to Arakan slavery into Bengal, more or less complete, because they established themselves strongly in Chittagong. And the last shipment from Bengal had 180 women and 20 children. And I wonder why they were taking so many women at that time, not earlier. This author also talks about unofficial number, and she suggests that there was also an unofficial slave trade going on, but there is obviously no official number to the unofficial slave trade. I was reading another article on unofficial slave trade by the Dutch, but I didn't get to kind of finish it before today. These are some numbers she gives of official slaves from Bengal. 28% women, 66% men, 2% boys, and so on. And the cost of clothing, the slaves. Can you read this? Can you see? I don't want to talk about it because I don't understand the costing yet. I won't be able to kind of assess, is it 1p or 2p? And the cost of feeding a slave. So, rice, dried fish, and sesame oil. I think sesame oil must be shorisha tel, isn't it? Must be. No, I know, but til, right? Okay, right. So it's shutki and rice, yeah, the best tastiest food. This is a depiction of slave market in Pipli, Orissa, right, which is the other side, not very far from West Bengal. You can see the slaves are in chain. But actually, I don't even know how those slaves were treated, how they were they in chain or were they whipped and beaten? There's not much information that I've seen so far. Now, the book, it gives a lot of details of capture of Bengali slave by different Arakani rulers, and one of this is how they used to capture, slaves from the method that they used to use. A Dutch officer on 2 trips to in Hooghly. That's a little bit later on from our time, in the 1660s, right? He observed patrolling the Hooghly River in small groups of 7-8 boats. Right? The Hooghly crews of jailers would prey on small groups of local boats, attacking the crews by night when they went ashore to cook their food. Likewise, they would attack villages at night and take the inhabitants away as slaves. So this is another method, and there are like Bengali songs, and I think poems as well, because I remember my mother used to tell me stories, about raids, by the Marathis and the Mugs and other pirates, right? Another report by a Wok merchant. So these are all from the the Dutch archives. Reported in a letter to his superior in 1623. That's the time when the first shipment of Bengali slaves started. The young king returned to Arakan with no less than 30,000 slaves. Those days there used to be a large casualty, so people used to die. Even in the 1960s, when I was growing up in Bangladesh, someone would get fever in the morning, they'd be dead in the afternoon. And the number of captured slaves that used to die was really, really large number. And then 10,000 slaves. Yeah, talks about disease and epidemics, the slaves used to go through. And there's a bit about how the Dutch used to try to keep them alive. Yeah, the Wok merchants tried to keep their slaves alive by separating the sick from the healthy, cleaning the slave quarters twice a day, bathing the slaves every day, and providing them with clean clothes every 2 days. Slaves were given fresh food such as chicken, pork, and so on. I couldn't find. There are accounts of the slaves in the Banda Islands. Early days, how they tried to escape, and how their relatives from other islands tried to help them. I think I'm going to sum up now. I've tried to share with you what I've learned so far, and I'm still trying to absorb, and understand a lot of the links and relationships, and maybe later on I'll be able to have a better grasp of the whole story, right? What I'm going she's already done that. I'm going to invite Azmir to read. Are you ready? Yeah.
You're going to sum up first, or should I read first?
Okay. Well, what it is, we were planning to develop a play, and today we were going to actually deliver a play, and for a number of reasons it wasn't possible. So we started to work on an imaginary story of Bengali slaves, in the Banda Island, and there wasn't enough information to work on, right? But we're still searching for more information, and I've been to the island, and I got sort of sense of where things are, right? So
A scene of tears inside a nutmeg plantation. In late 1624, on a nutmeg plantation in Longtor Island, which by then became overgrown with weeds, a group of Bengali slaves were put to work together with slaves from other places. As they go to know each other, they learned a few things about each other's journeys. They also saw skulls and bones scattered nearby around the places, found the place to be very scary, and felt that there were ghosts all around. They were not officially told anything about what had happened to the native islanders. What the Dutch did just a few years ago, before their forceful transportation from their homelands into the Bandas. A few surviving native islanders were brought back to the Banda Islands from Batavia, present-day Jakarta, to work on the nutmeg plantations, primarily to teach and instruct the new arrival slaves how to undertake the upkeep of the nutmeg gardens and harvest the spice. Some of the returning Bandanese related the story of the Banda Genocide, which took place in 1621, to the new slaves who came from many different places. On a particular day in a late afternoon, while working in one of the plantations, it started to rain and became heavier. Some Bengali slaves gathered around the umbrella-like protection from the trunks and leaves of the tall canary tree. Canary trees were scattered around the nutmeg gardens that provided shade from the strong sun that beams its light from the near equator direction. A dozen slaves sat on the base of a particularly giant canary tree. next to and surrounded by many shorter nutmeg trees, from emerging small fruits to larger, ripe ones just beginning to split open in the middle, showing their brilliant net-like crimson color structure that covers the hard shell of the nutmeg, the core of the fruit. One Bengali slave started to weep, which triggered a few others to join in as they missed their families and homeland, and soon became a crying chorus. Their sadness grew stronger when the memory of their homeland got combined with what they heard of the massacre of the Banda people in 1621. The rain kept falling on the ground all around them and made the forests become darker through the thick cloud blocking the sun. The heavy rain did not make them very wet as they were protected by the canary tree umbrella above, although drops of water fell on them flying in from many directions. They saw dozens of small nutmeg trees surrounding them, located between them larger canary trees, and rainwater was pouring to the ground, navigating through the leaves and creating complex and varied patterns on the ground. In their sad state of mind and experiencing despair, they started to feel and imagine that the nutmeg trees around the plantations were weeping, and it was the tears that were falling on the ground, as if the nutmeg trees were missing the people who were always around for decades, clearing up the weeds, cutting the dead plants, planting new seedlings, and harvesting the spice, but were there no more. The slaves' weeping minds imagined that the tears of the nutmeg trees were caused by the trees missing the hundreds of women and men and those cute smiling children who were no longer running around and picking up the nutmeg fruits. A failed escape for freedom. A few weeks later, a few slaves brought in from another island in present-day Indonesia plotted an escape and shared the idea with some Bengali slaves. Most of the Bengali slaves were very tired and knew it took them more than 6 months to travel from Bengal to Banda by sea. It would be very difficult to go back, even if they escaped. But 2 of the Bengali slaves decided that they could not endure life as slaves anymore, and also that these strange mountainous lands, there was very little fresh water, and no river fish were to be found unlike in Bengal. They decided to join the others and imagined that it would be better to die, like nearly half the Bengali slaves brought in at Arakan by the Dutch, who died en route, than to live a few years as slaves. So one moonlit night, when some of the slaves made arrangements to escape during the dark hours by a local boat, which was going to come from the Kai Island, 2 Bengali slaves joined 10 others and departed Lontar Island at dead of night, guided only by the moonlight. But after rowing for about half an hour, a strong easterly wind and large waves blew them towards Gunung Api Island, and when not very far from the land, the boat overturned. All those on board managed to swim to the nearest land on the base of the high volcanic forested island of Gunung Api, the Fire Mountain. Although very green and lush with many coconut and mango trees, the volcanic island had very little edible food. They slept hungry that night, but over the next few days they searched and finally caught some birds and roasted them on fire they created, and supplemented their diet with the soft flesh and delicious water from young coconuts. The 12 escaped slaves tried to survive without much water or food. They kept a lookout for small birds passing by to see if they can get a ride and hide from the patrolling ships and junks used by the Dutch. After a few days, both the Bengali slaves, who had no experience of living in lands such as the Bandas, died in the humid and covered forest through hunger and exhaustion after catching a fever.
Thank you. I'm finished now. You can ask me some questions. Any question?
What do you plan on doing with, like, what's your next step with this research?
I'm going to go back again, spend a bit more time, and try and understand and familiarize myself with the locations of various things that I have read about, and also look around, talk to people. Oh right, yeah. Right. So and you see, when I was in when I went to the small island Roon, the island that was kept by the English, I was taken. There's a guest house there. I didn't stay in the guest house because I came in the morning and left in the afternoon. But the guest house guy joined my guide from the other island and took me around the nutmeg plantation. Also took me to a school where school children. I actually gave a talk to the school children, and then it was translated. And one of the questions the school children asked me, why was nutmeg so expensive in Europe? Because it's so cheap there, right? I said the demand, there's so many people wanted this wonderful thing. So what I found is that people in those islands are very aware of their history. They're being told. And you see what happened, Roon Island was the only island that was claimed by the English king because of the contract that Nathaniel Courthope managed to get the local Orang Kayas to sign, even though the Dutch took over. But later on in 1667, when the English, few years before, took over Manhattan Island, which was occupied by the Dutch, which was being developed by the Dutch, then they signed a contract treaty in 1667, where they officially swapped those islands. At that time, Manhattan wasn't, nothing. Whereas Nutmeg Island, Banda Island were the most expensive real estate in the world at that time. But now it's the other way around. Everybody knows about Manhattan in Banda. Nobody knows in Europe about Banda. Sorry, in New York about Banda. But a few years ago, that book I had. Can I just show this book? This book was produced in 2017 to kind of mark, the 350th anniversary of the Treaty of Breda. When it was officially swapped, right, by the Dutch and the English. This book is so beautiful. A small article written by about 30 people, I think, and really good writers. They write little, but it's so beautifully written, and you get so much out of this. Did I answer the question? Any other question?
You said you're going these places?
Yes, I took this picture. Yeah, I was there. Yeah.
You went there?
This is my picture. Yeah.
Right.
So what?
When will you have your next conference?
I don't know yet, but what I'm hoping to do is I'm hoping to produce a book in 2021, for two reasons. One is Bangladesh independence, 50 years, and also 400 years of Banda Massacre. Yeah. I won't get a publisher, so I'll self-publish. I think that's...
How long was your tour when you went last time? I remember we spoke online, but I couldn't work out how long you were there.
It's not easy to get there, right?
Exactly.
And also, I would have liked to stay longer, but then I had to get the ship to get back to Ambon. I was only there for about 7 days. Right? It's not long, right? Yeah? You grow to love the place, and people are so friendly, and it's so safe. There's no crime. People tell me there's no crime. That's what I like. Yeah. Sorry. I think first.
Were people aware when they were? Because this is really parallel to now, in the sense of were people aware that they were signing up for security and giving up freedom?
No. Thing is, there's no written account of from the Bandani side, because they were killed. The present population, they know they're a mixed people, came from everywhere, right? So they know this is a unique population that developed, right, through mixing. So there is no account from the Bandanese side. But you can tell most they were reluctant. They didn't want to sign. What they wanted, because they enjoyed like free trade, trading with everybody, and they need sagu, they need rice, they need textiles. Dutch were not bringing all those, right? They were just buying the nutmegs at a very cheap price, the fixed price. Before they killed, they were bargaining first. Then they started to fix the price when they managed to get the Bandanese to sign even a stricter contract, right? I think soon they felt uncomfortable, because see, the Portuguese were harassing them for nearly 100 years, and the Bandanese fought back against the Portuguese, and the Portuguese abandoned their attempt to build forts. But then Portuguese is still coming, buying the spices and also messing around in that part of the world. So when the Dutch arrives, proclaiming that they're enemies of Portuguese, and Portuguese were harassing people all over Asia, for nearly 100 years. So initially, the people were quite happy, that somebody come, enemies of Portuguese, and they will help kind of prevent the Portuguese. And all the contracts were, it's like they're allies, they will protect them. But in return, they must only promise to sell nutmeg to them initially. But later on, it became also they must send, there cannot be any inter-island trade without Dutch passes. Yeah, and restrictions started to increase. Did you want to ask some further?
That's really interesting. Thanks. I have a couple of questions. The first one was, this Cohen fella, is he been properly villainized in history?
I don't know too much, right? But English sources have been villainizing him for a long time, right? Because he's the one who kicked them out of the Spice Island, ultimately, and defeated them in Jakarta, and so on. But some Dutch writers have, initially, what I read is that the Gentlemen 17 were the board in Amsterdam, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company board. They were initially a little bit kind of unhappy and alarmed, but then he brought them a lot of benefits, and his wages were increased. And recently, if you Google, I didn't read the story carefully. Recently, there was a controversy because they wanted to remove. I think they put one of his statue in Netherlands somewhere.
He was a national hero for 200 years.
200 years, yeah.
And he comes from Horn, so they have a big memorial for him because it's his birth town and so on. But he's now revisited by a Dutch historian. So he was a national hero for a long, long time, while the Dutch were still the empire of the East. And he built it, basically. Without him, it wouldn't happen. And the cruelty was also played down, of course, for those hundreds of years. But it's now revisited.
Yeah, because I've only started to read recently, so I'm not familiar with the whole range of, right, assessment, reassessment. But I've read some critical writings from the Dutch as well, right, Dutch side about Cohen. And obviously in Banda, everybody knows Cohen. I ask somebody, "Are you a friend of Cohen?" "Oh, no." Another, did you?
Yeah. So, the Battle of Plassey to this massacre, via this Morocco slave markets in Arakan.
No, Battle of Plassey was much later.
No, but before, like the Brooklyn Circle, right?
All right.
So it's like, when you look at that whole Bengal becoming under the thumb, and then got Banda and these places coming under the thumb, what do you think the difference is?
Difference between Banda and Battle of Plassey?
No, just that whole period of having your economy and your power depleted and...
I didn't think about it like that, right? The Battle of Plassey, we were doing earlier, and obviously the Battle of Plassey led to the ruin of Bengal for a quite considerable amount of time, the economy and everything, and there was a lot of benefits that this country got, and especially people associated with the East India Company who benefited and so on. But in terms of Banda, what I understand now is that the capture of Banda, and then the control of the cloves as well, because they didn't manage to monopolize pepper, right? And they made so much money. I've read some figures, but I don't have here, and I haven't thought about it to kind of compare or understand the contextual kind of significance of the the amount of money that they made. But what I understand is that that played a very important role in how Netherlands developed, and how it became rich, and a lot of other flourishing of arts and architecture and things like that. Yeah. Did you know something?
Done? Right. I really admire your interest in history. Definitely, this is something that you are doing which is very unique. What inspired you to revive the history of last 500 years? And also, how do you finance your mission? It's a big one.
It's a good one.
Actually, it doesn't cost much, but I'll tell you about a little bit. There wasn't like a master plan of doing work on history. It's like one thing leads to another. You go into one area, then you develop an interest. But in general, what I learned is that history is something very powerful, and I've noticed the difference between people who understand history, who have good knowledge on history, who engage in interpreting history.